I won't read the lecture. I will introduce a speaker who most of you know, some quite well. It's Al McCoy, who joined our faculty here 3 years ago, in the fall of '89, after teaching at the University of New South Wales in Australia for 11 years. He has his PhD in history from Yale, before that an MA in Southeast Asian Studies from Berkeley, and an undergraduate degree, BA, from Columbia. I won't bother to list the numerous grants and awards that he's received, but I would like to point out that his writings, both on the drug trafficking and the drug problems worldwide and on the Philippines, have won book awards. Among others, his publications include The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which splashed onto the front page of the New York Times Book Review in 1972. That has recently been revised and published just last year as The Politics of Heroin, with a slightly wider scope than the original book. He also wrote Priests on Trial and edited Southeast Asia under the Japanese occupation, Philippine Social History, and Laos War and Revolution, and co-wrote with Alfredo Roces, Philippine Cartoons, Political Caricatures of the American Era, 1900 and 1941. So I'm sure most of you are well aware of Professor McCoy's distinguished reputation, so I'll simply turn it over to him, and he will tell us about heroin as a global commodity, the Southeast Asian opium trade, 1773 to 1991.
That's pretty good, Andy. If you don't want to just keep going, it's all right there.
Well, I could give a Michael Cullinane.
No, you could give the lecture. Let me offer a lecture in several parts. First of all, an introduction, which is personal in nature, then one which is conceptual, and then finally into a substantive discussion of the topic, heroin as a global commodity, the Southeast Asian opium trade. The first part, my personal introduction. During the quarter century that I have been studying the Philippines, I have taken 3 short sabbaticals to do drugs. My drug of choice has been Southeast Asian heroin. My first such sabbatical came in 1971 when, lured by the sound of distant gunfire, I took a semester's leave from Yale University Graduate School to follow the heroin trail from the battlefields of South Vietnam to the opium hills of northern Laos. The product of that inquiry, published as The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, was more expose than explanation, but there was a reason. At the time when I did this research, at a time when Southeast Asia was already the world's leading producer of raw, illicit opium, Americans, official and academic, knew nearly nothing about this region's drug trade. Let me cite one example of official ignorance. In March 1965, the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics, the antecedent of our current DEA, or Drug Enforcement Administration, compiled a list of 246 international drug traffickers. Of the 246, only 2 were from Southeast Asia. Both were minor Corsican figures. Only 2 figures from a region that was the world's major producer of illicit drugs. Official ignorance, I think, clearly demonstrated. The book's publication in August 1972 coincided with then-President Richard Nixon's declaration of war on drugs, the first of 3 such American drug wars. Not surprisingly, my charges of U.S. government complicity in the Southeast Asian heroin trade earned me a taste of the full force of the American state. During my field research in the opium villages of northern Laos, CIA mercenaries ambushed me with automatic weapons. Once I submitted my manuscript to my publisher Harper & Row, the Deputy Director for Plans, a euphemism for covert operations, of the CIA, Mr. Cordmeyer, Jr., paid a personal call upon my publisher, Mr. Cass Canfield, Sr., to pressure him to suppress my book. Failing in that effort, the CIA mounted a sustained campaign to discredit the book. CIA operatives in Laos and Vietnam pressed my sources to recant. The director of the CIA publicly attacked my book. The CIA privately briefed Congress to discredit my charges. Following the book's publication, the IRS audited my income taxes. Then HEW reviewed my graduate fellowship, and the FBI tapped my telephone. There are only a few threads in the social fabric of a graduate student, and the Nixon administration tugged at every one of mine, coming close, rather close to unraveling the thin tapestry of my life. After completing my dissertation at Yale and unable to find a job in the United States for reasons that I've never been able to fully fathom, I took up a postdoctoral fellowship at the Austrian National University. My arrival at Canberra in 1977 coincided with the first surge of Southeast Asian heroin into Australia, a trend that aroused deep concern in that country. In response, I took my second sabbatical from Philippine history to write a book titled Drug Traffic, Narcotics and Organized Crime in Australia, the country's first academic inquiry into either topic. Finally, my third sabbatical. In June 1989, I returned to America to take up an appointment at Madison, and within 3 months found myself watching President Bush's declaration of his war on drugs. You remember that White House press conference in which President Bush held up a crack bag that was purchased at Lafayette Park right in front of the White House that turned out wasn't actually bought there, it was bought somewhere else. A kind of metaphor for how things have gone in that drug war. Since the drug trade's essential dynamics had not changed in the 20 years since I had first published my book, I decided to revise it, making explicit analytical themes implicit in the first edition. And let me share then those insights, these latter-day insights into this problem with you today. Let me begin then with a conceptual introduction. And let me start with an event. Historians like events. In 1989, Southeast Asia achieved the dual distinction of becoming the world's largest producer of raw opium and the major source of America's illicit heroin supply. According to the U.S. State Department's 1989 report on international narcotics control, Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle region, where the highlands of Burma, Thailand, and Laos converge, produced 3,000 metric tons of raw opium, equivalent to 64% of the world's total illicit supply. In February 1991, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration announced that Southeast Asia's share of the U.S. heroin market rose sharply from 18% in 1987 to 45% that year, making the Golden Triangle America's #1 heroin supplier. Between 1984 and 1990, Southeast Asia's share of the New York City heroin market jumped from 5 to 80%. As heroin surged into New York in unprecedented quantities in the early 1990s, the city's wholesale price per kilo dropped from $100,000 to $60,000, creating a new clientele for this pure, smokable drug. Thus, what American enforcement experts had long feared had finally come to pass. To wit, the globe's great opium reserve in northern Burma had merged with the world's premier heroin market, New York City, producing a sudden resurgence in American heroin abuse. How can we explain Southeast Asia's conquest of the global heroin market? Although Western observers have long assumed an axiomatic and ahistorical cultural equation between Asia and opium, Southeast Asia's emergence as the world's premier opium producer is a very recent development, the final stage in an obscure historical process that began more than 2 centuries ago. This process, and the answer to our question, explains heroin's little understood character. Heroin is, I am going to argue, a global commodity. And in arguing such, I think I'll be conducting a fundamental redefinition of how this drug is perceived in the United States. Just because heroin has been a part of American life as a legal and illegal drug for nearly 100 years, will we commemorate the centenary? Will Bayer sponsor advertisements? I don't think so. But anyway, we're coming hard upon the centenary of this unique aspect of our American life. Just because it's been a part of our lives for so long does not necessarily mean that we really understand in a fundamental sense what heroin is. Over the past 200 years, opium and its derivative heroin have emerged as major global commodities, with production systems and a political economy similar in scale and kind to other major stimulants in the commodities trade, to wit, coffee and tea. Before we go further, I think we need to understand that commodities are something that we may not fully grasp. We need to give thickness to this thin word that floats so lightly in the air, that sits so two-dimensional upon my page. Let's offer a ready-made definition here. Commodities are not mere trade goods. They are the building blocks of modern material life. Their production is central to third world survival, and their consumption is integral to the fabric of first world lifestyles. Let me now try and give thickness to those thin words. Throughout their long careers, two of America's most distinguished anthropologists, Sidney Mintz and Eric Wolf, have taught us that the modern commerce in commodities involves much more than mere economic exchange. Concluding his study of sugar as a commodity, titled Sweetness and Power, Sidney Mintz comments, and I quote, "The first sweetened cup of hot tea to be drunk by an English worker was a significant historical event because it prefigured the transformation of an entire society, a total remaking of its economic and social basis." In sum, Mintz seems to be telling us that these commodities, sugar and tea, were, among others, the very vehicles that transformed British society, carrying England, and with it the world, forward into modernity. Indeed, from the 18th century onwards, tea and opium were a part of an expanding commerce between Asia and the Atlantic nations. Keeping in mind our definition of what heroin as a commodity or opium as a commodity might be, let us look at some statistics to gain a sense of opium's character as a commodity. Let's turn first to indices of third world production and consumption at century's turn. By 1906, China produced 35,000 tons of raw opium. To me, that sings of a commodity trade. Well, for those of you that don't deal with these statistics, what do these numbers mean? We can put that in the back of our Volkswagen. We require a container vessel, 35,000 tons. These numbers numb. What do they mean? Well, 35,000 tons is larger than Japan's tea crop of 31,000 tons. It approaches the bulk of Colombia's coffee crop of that year of 55,000 tons. It's over a third of the size of China's own premier commodity, tea, at 90,000 tons. That same year, 1906, China had 13.5 million opium addicts, equivalent to 27% of its adult male population. So at century's turn, 1 in 4 Chinese adult males was an opium addict. Let's look at some anecdotal evidence from the First World. By the 1890s, the distribution of opiates and coca products in the First World had become the basis of a thriving pharmaceutical industry producing widespread narcotics abuse. In 1898, the Bayer Company of Germany coined the phrase heroin, a trade name to market the drug known chemically as diacetyl morphine. A year before Bayer coined an equally popular and successful trade name for another very important painkiller that it called aspirin. During the 1890s, Parke Davis Company of Detroit, a major American pharmaceutical manufacturer, became a cocaine specialist with a lucrative line of coca cordials, coca cigarettes, coca tonics, and coca pills. During the latter half of the 19th century, England's consumption of tea per capita increased 3 times, and its consumption of opiate-based patent medicines increased 7 times. In the same period, U.S. coffee consumption increased 3 times, and U.S. opium consumption per capita increased 4 times. During the 1890s, moreover, the estimated number of U.S. heroin habitués and opiate addicts as a proportion of population reached an historic peak, never since equaled. Although we can debate causality, which is an area outside my expertise, the consequence of this historic change seems beyond a dispute. Over the past 2 centuries, opium had thus become a major global commodity, linking the cities of Asia and the West to a highland opium zone stretching for some 5,000 miles across the southern mountain rim of Asia from Turkey to Thailand. Heroin's character as a commodity explains the reasons underlying 2 key aspects of our contemporary drug problem, which are to say CIA protection of the drug lords and the repeated failure of America's attempt at prohibition of drug consumption through its wars on drugs. To put it in 2 words, heroin's character as a commodity is illuminated by 2 factors, prohibition and protection. Let's look at those factors. The first, prohibition. Since the start of the narcotics prohibition in the 1920s, both in the United States and in the world, most attempts at interdiction have not only failed to eradicate this global commodity trade, they have contributed quite directly to an expansion of both production and consumption of narcotics. Over the past 20 years, the mysteries, the alchemy of capitalism, has thus transformed the lead of repression into the gold of stimulus. After 3 U.S. drug wars under Presidents Nixon, Reagan, and Bush, global opium production rose from 1,000 tons in 1970 to 4,200 tons in 1991, a dramatic 420% increase due very directly to these failed attempts at prohibition. The next factor, protection. Over the past 40 years, government intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, have served as the protectors of Southeast Asia's key drug traffickers, contributing to an initial expansion of opium production that I will describe as I move into my lecture. Through an accident of history, this 5,000-mile-long Asian opium zone from Turkey to Thailand just happened to parallel the border of China and the Soviet Union, making it a key southern front of Cold War confrontation. As the CIA mounted operations in the opium zone, probing the southern border of China and the Soviet Union during the 40 years of the Cold War, it found that opium brokers and warlords were the most effective of its possible covert action assets. Surveying the steady increase in America's drug problems since the end of World War II, I can thus discern periodic surges in U.S. drug supply that coincide with CIA covert operations in the drug zones. Thus, to understand the dynamics underlying the Golden Triangle's conquest of the global heroin market, our problem in this lecture, we must probe the modern history of this peculiar commodity, focusing on our twin themes of protection and prohibition. Let me begin then with the colonial opium trade. The modern opium trade, the rise of opium as a commodity, began, to pick a date arbitrarily, in 1773, when it's a date that lies as much as it tells truth, but nonetheless, we've got to move on. 1773, when the British East India Company, through its Calcutta office, took direct control of the export of Indian opium to China. As the East India Company expanded its exports over the next 75 years, opium became a major global commodity, giving this modern commerce in this drug a scale and organizational sophistication that distinguishes it from its ancient and medieval forms, opium as folk pharmacopoeia, opium as item in Asian regional trade. By 1780, the East India Company had imposed a centralized marketing system over the Bengal opium industry that accelerated the export of Indian opium to China from 75 tons in 1776 to 3,200 tons in 1850. Needing trade goods for the purchase of Chinese tea, British merchants used opium as a medium for the manipulation of a complex triangular trade between India, China, and Europe that reached a remarkable volume of 20 million pounds sterling per leg by the 1820s. 22 million pounds worth of Indian cotton and opium to Canton, 20 million pounds worth of Chinese tea from Canton to England, 24 million pounds worth of British finished goods to India. In 1842 and 1858, Britain fought 2 wars along the China coast to rationalize and improve this trade, forcing the Chinese Empire to open itself to unrestricted opium imports. Speculating about the probable impact of these legal opium imports, Karl Marx, who for once got it right, described it in the pages of the New York Daily Tribune on October 15, 1858, when he commented, quote, "The Chinese government will try a method recommended by political and financial considerations, viz. To legalize the cultivation of the poppy in China." Indeed, Chinese officials began encouraging local production, and poppy cultivation spread beyond the southwest of China to nearly every province. By 1880, China's leading opium-producing province, Sichuan, in the southwest, harvested some 10,000 tons of raw opium, compared to only 5,000 tons worth of opium imported from India. The scandal of China's mass opium addiction prompted a global attempt at prohibition, of which our contemporary drug wars are the direct lineal descendant. The global prohibition movement was launched by activist partisan denominations in the 1870s. The global anti-opium movement scored its first victory in the Philippines in 1906 when a colonial commission, with an Episcopal missionary bishop as a member, recommended the prohibition of smoking opium in this American colony, becoming the first time any American government had banned a drug. Almost simultaneously, the British Parliament passed a motion of the House instructing Her Majesty's Indian government to negotiate an end to its opium exports to China. Under such pressure, Delhi and Peking negotiated a treaty prohibiting, over a period of 10 years, Indian exports of opium to China and China's domestic production of opium. Meeting at Shanghai in February 1909 at the world's first international narcotics conference. This meeting in San Antonio is just one of many that have followed upon this Shanghai meeting. The United States, Britain, France, China, and other powers agreed upon an agenda for the international interdiction of opium, thereby launching our modern drug diplomacy, which continues until this week. Slowed by the revolution of 1911 and subsequent political chaos, later Chinese governments tried, with greater and lesser sincerity, to suppress opium smoking. China's attempt at prohibition led by the 1930s, through the dynamics of this peculiar commodity, to Shanghai's rise as the world's leading producer of illicit heroin and Shanghai's role as the main supplier of New York City's criminal syndicates. Let's turn now to Southeast Asia. Lying astride the major maritime routes between Calcutta and Canton, Southeast Asia was drawn into an expanding Asian opium trade, eventually emerging as a significant secondary market for both Indian and Chinese opium production. During the early 19th century, opium became a major factor in Southeast Asia's economic growth, both public and private sectors, reflecting and reinforcing the region's ongoing modernization. By 1930, Southeast Asia had a very profitable complex of legal state opium monopolies. The region in sum had 6,441 licensed opium dens, serving 272 tons of opium to 542,100 registered smokers. Opium income ranged from 14% of all tax revenues in Siam to 58% in British Malaya. In no other region of the world did so many governments promote mass opium consumption with such unanimity of means and moral certitude. Despite extensive opium consumption during the decade immediately preceding World War II, it is important for our purposes to note that Southeast Asia still remained an insignificant opium producer. In 1940, Southeast Asia harvested a total of only 15.5 tons, 15.5 tons, in a region that today produces over 3,000 tons. Why so little before World War II? Since India supplied these government monopolies with limitless, low-cost opium, Southeast Asia governments had no reason to encourage local cultivation. Indeed, their profits came from an artificially high price for the drug, and they were desperately concerned to extirpate smuggling. Local production would have complicated that task, hence it was discouraged. Thus, the sudden growth of the Golden Triangle's opium production is a post-war phenomenon. It occurs in the 1950s and appears in retrospect a response to two stimuli, prohibition and protection. Let's look at the prohibition factor. Responding to international pressures, drug diplomacy was marching apace. Southeast Asia's governments abolished legal opium sales between 1950 and 1961, thereby creating an instant demand for illicit opiates in Hong Kong and the cities of Southeast Asia. The second factor, protection. The supply for this illicit market created by prohibition was generated by protection. An alliance of three intelligence agencies, Thai, American, and Nationalist Chinese, played a catalytic role in promoting the production of raw opium supplies on the Shan Plateau of northern Burma in the 1950s. During this decade, CIA-covered operations in northern Burma fostered political alliances that linked the poppy fields of Burma with Southeast Asia's urban drug markets. After the collapse of the Nationalist Chinese government in 1949, some of its forces fled across the border into Burma. I like to think in the map as the collapse of China disgorging the nationalist forces in two directions, southeast to Taiwan, where they remain, and southwest across the border of Yunnan into northern Burma. The CIA, acting under instructions of President Harry Truman to open a second front in the Korean War, used its air logistics and armed support to transform the 14,000 ragtag remnants of the nationalist Chinese forces in northeastern Burma into a covert action army, arming and supplying them for at least three invasions of southwestern China in 1950 and 51. These invasions were repulsed with heavy casualties. They were a covert action joke. The nationalist troops camped along the border after this debacle for another decade, turning to opium trading to finance their operations as CIA support dwindled. Forcing local hill tribes to produce opium through a mix of paramilitary coercion and market incentives, the nationalist troops supervised over a massive increase of poppy cultivation on the Shan Plateau. After a combined operation by the People's Liberation Army of China and the Burmese army evicted the nationalist forces from their bases in northeastern Burma in 1961, these same nationalist forces established new base camps just across the border in Thailand, and there they remain today, playing a major role in the Shan State's opium trade 40 years after the CIA installed them in the region. Even after the CIA ended covert operations in this region in 1975, its former assets, the KMT, and the reigning heroin king Kun Sa, maintained control of what had become well-established opium production systems, processing ever larger quantities for the world market. Let's turn to the case study of Indochina during the Vietnam War era. After abolition of the opium monopoly in 1950, that French opium monopoly that produced 15% of government revenues, French military intelligence imposed a centralized covert control over an illicit drug traffic that linked the Hmong poppy fields of northern Laos with the opium dens of Saigon. When America replaced the French in Vietnam, the CIA fell heir to these covert action alliances and their indirect involvement in opium trading. But the CIA did not suffer the same financial imperatives that had forced the French into a direct control over the traffic. The CIA involvement remained indirect. From 1961 to 1974, the CIA maintained an army of 30,000 Hmong tribesmen in the mountains of northern Laos, a secret war that required CIA support for the tribe's main cash crop, opium. Although the agency did not profit directly from the opium trade, the combat strength of its secret army was nonetheless integrated with the Laotian opium trade. Why? The answer lies in the CIA's doctrine of indirect intervention and its consequent reliance upon the influence of local warlords, local military leaders. In the case of Laos, the CIA's reliance upon a Hmong leader named Major Vang Pao. The CIA sent in covert action cadre to Laos on a ratio of about 1 American agent for every 1,000 Hmong hill tribe guerrillas, giving the agency at best an indirect control that made it dependent upon a local ally, a local political broker, to mobilize that tribe for guerrilla warfare. Using its formidable air power, the CIA gave its chosen client, Vang Pao, control over airdrops of rice into the Hmong villages and the air shipment of opium out of those Hmong villages. With his chokehold over these two key commodities in the Hmong household economy, opium and rice, Major Vang Pao was transformed from a minor officer of low traditional status into a tribal warrior who could and did extract boy soldiers from the Hmong villages for slaughter in an endless war which the Hmong could never win. Since opium trading reinforced Vang Pao's authority, the CIA found it convenient to tolerate the traffic. The CIA's policy of tolerance towards its Laotian allies did not change even in 1968-69 when they began producing heroin to supply American combat forces fighting in South Vietnam. In 1968-69, the CIA's Laotian clients, including General Vang Pao and the commander of the Royal Lao Army, General Uwan Ratakon, brought in chemists, Chinese chemists from Hong Kong, to open a cluster of heroin laboratories in the tri-border region where Burma, Thailand, and Laos converge. The CIA turned a blind eye to General Uwan's heroin lab, which was then the world's largest, since he provided the military mantle that legitimated the CIA's control and operation of a secret army in a supposedly neutralist nation. All this heroin was smuggled south into South Vietnam for sale to American GIs. By 1971, according to a later White House survey, 34% of all U.S. combat forces in South Vietnam were addicted to this heroin. If we accept this figure, this White House figure, that 34% of U.S. soldiers in South Vietnam were heroin users by 1971, then there were more American heroin addicts in Indochina than in the United States itself, and all of these Indochina addicts were supplied by our own allies. Let's turn now to Southeast Asia's move to the world market, its ultimate conquest of the global heroin trade. As American troops began withdrawing from Vietnam in 1972, President Nixon inadvertently created a new market for Southeast Asian heroin by declaring war on drugs in the Mediterranean. As the grandmother of the 3 drug wars the United States has fought over the past 20 years, Nixon's effort commands our attention. Despite a short-term victory in this drug war in Turkey, there were 2 long-term consequences of this drug war. 1, increased global opium production. 2, increased global heroin consumption. The Nixon drug war at that time had a positively seductive appeal. You may have seen Gene Hackman's wonderful movies, French Connection 1 and 2. Some of your younger generation haven't even heard of these movies, much less seen them. I keep forgetting every year they're younger. They're frighteningly younger. They're now born after the Vietnam War even started. This is all utter memory, something their fathers did. At the time, the appeal of the drug war was quite understandable. In the United States, American police were chasing drugs around the street. Why not go to the source? And the source at that time was remarkably limited, and the traffic was very tightly structured. In Turkey itself, there were opium farmers registered with the Turkish government producing opium for legitimate pharmaceutical exports. However, these same farmers took an extra scraping from the poppies and diverted this to the illicit market, which crossed the Mediterranean to Marseille, where Corsican syndicates manufactured that raw opium into heroin, and then, just like in the movies, it transited across the Atlantic, entering the United States through organized crime families based in Montreal, arriving in New York, where the 5 families of New York distributed in the New York metropolitan area, and to a lesser extent across the country. For a quarter century, from the late 1940s until Nixon's drug war, the drug trade operated in this very predictable, tightly structured manner. The appeal therefore was enormous. Wipe out the entire traffic, clean up heroin off the streets, close down the Marseille heroin labs by going to the Anatolian Plateau, fighting a war and wiping it out. And it was a wonderful, a brilliant victory. It was the kind of victory that George Bush wouldn't even aspire to today. It was a total 100% wipe-out eradication of Turkish opium production. Turkey was living under the shadow of the Russian bear. The Cold War was at its height. Turkey was a poor NATO ally. We called, they answered. It was either NATO, the arms, and the alliance, or get rid of the drugs. And by the by, here's $35 million in aid to make it palatable. So the Turkish government weighed up the NATO alliance against the interests of a number of peasant opium farmers in this small region of the country, and guess what? They decided that the peasants of Anatolia would pay the price, and they wiped out the opium market and totally destroyed it. The Marseille heroin labs went dry, and it looked like a great victory. By mid-1970, the street price of heroin in New York had tripled, and purity had dropped by half, strong indicators of a serious shortage on the streets in New York. Ironically, President Nixon's victory on Turkey's Anatolian Plateau increased global drug demand, unleashing unpredicted market forces that would ultimately expand both production and consumption of illicit narcotics. Why? The Nixon drug war rested on the premise that Turkey was an isolated opium producer that could be eliminated through a strong enforcement effort. In effect, by bringing the blunt baton of law enforcement down upon a complex global commodity trade, the Nixon administration unleashed market forces they did not grasp at the time. Turkey was, in fact, a minor producer of just 7.0% of the world's illicit opium supply, a minor producer that lay at the westernmost extremity of a near-continuous opium zone that stretched for 5,000 miles along the mountain rim of Asia, through Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Burma, Thailand, Laos. Responding to the market stimulus of Turkish eradication, shortfall in supply, raised price, creating an incentive for increased production, the Chinese syndicates of Southeast Asia began exporting their surplus heroin to America, in effect following the GIs home. By early 1975, Southeast Asia's share of the U.S. heroin market had doubled to 22%. The Nixon administration reacted again. I've done interviews with agents who can recall Nixon aide Ejel Crow pulling them by the lapel to the map, pointing to Thailand and say, "Go get me opium caravans." And indeed, they did. The Nixon administration dispatched a firebreak team of 30 U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration agents to Bangkok in 1973-74, armed with a war chest of $12 million to cut the flow of Thai heroin to the United States. Armed with these funds, The Bangkok DEA began making substantial seizures of U.S.-bound heroin in cooperation with Thai police forces, creating a kind of de facto customs barrier on the export of Southeast Asia heroin to the United States. Ship a kilo to America, you run a very good chance of it getting seized, your courier picked up, your apparatus enmeshed in the courts. There began to be a very high threshold of cost and pain in exporting drugs to the United States. Thus, by the end of 1975, Southeast Asia's share of the U.S. market had dropped to only 8%, based on chemical testing of street samples from across the country. It was, again, another victory, but a victory that had a paradoxical, unpredicted reaction in the market. Since the DEA did not eradicate opium cultivation on the Shan Plateau or close the heroin refineries in northern Thailand, its seizures simply erected this customs shield, deflecting exports from the United States to other markets. Unable to export to the United States, Southeast Asian syndicates began exporting to Europe and Australia, which then had almost no heroin addiction. Let's look at the statistics from the 1970s to see how suddenly there is an influx of Southeast Asian heroin, very dramatic and discernible in these two new markets. Total European seizures of Southeast Asian number 3 heroin jumped from 22 pounds in 1972 to 873 pounds in 1978. In the Netherlands, estimated addict population increased from 800 in 1970 to some 10,000 by 1975. In West Germany, the only real hard index of consumption in the drug trade began to appear very dramatically. Deaths from heroin overdoses increased from 9 in 1969 to 623 a decade later. Similarly, in Australia, narcotics arrests in the state of New South Wales, the country's premier heroin market, increased fivefold from 173 in 1972 to 909 in 1977. Although Nixon's drug war thus stimulated the global market, its impact on the U.S. domestic demand was more ambiguous. I don't know whether it worked here or not. I don't know if it was the war that worked or other factors. Let's think about it a bit. In the late 1970s, every indicator after the Nixon drug war pointed to a marked decline in U.S. heroin supply. The estimated number of heroin addicts dropped from 500,000 to 200,000 in the United States. Well, that's debatable. The government always fudges those figures. It's just leisure to man. That approach is lying. Heroin purity, however, declined markedly in New York City. That's discernible and testable. That's lab results. Heroin price, that's police reports. That's pretty reliable. That went up. Our key indicators: addicts down, purity down, price up. That means short supply. Why the decline? Why the shortfall in supply? Could be the drug war. Can't say. But maybe there was another factor. Maybe our factors of prohibition and protection are operating even at this period. Perhaps Nixon's drug war may have actually succeeded in disrupting the flow of drugs in the United States. Let's look at it. After Southeast Asia was blocked, Turkey was wiped, Mexico came in to fill the void. Although Mexico's share of the U.S. heroin market jumped from 40% in 1972 to a remarkable 89% in 1975 to meet shortages in the market from this process I've described, Mexico's erratic supply of a crude number 3 heroin somehow failed to meet U.S. demand in the same way that Europe or Southeast Asian pure number 4 heroin had. Maybe our factors of prohibition and protection were the dominant factors. Perhaps President Carter's ban on major CIA-covered operations from 1976 to 1978 may have removed the protection that the drug lords seemed to require. You remember those events. Nixon's Saturday night massacre of 800 covered action agents who were given their pink slips like they were used car dealers in the midst of a recession. I mean, just thrown into the street without any dignity. Boy, they got even.
When was that?
The late 1970s. Admiral Stansfield Turner cashiered 800 covered action operatives. I don't know the precise date off the top of my head. If it's not on the paper, I don't remember it, so I didn't write it down. I have to look it up. Similarly, President Carter's abandonment of an aggressive drug war policy of prohibition. He didn't fight many drug wars. Little operation down in Mexico, not much effect. Maybe the abandonment of this drug war policy of a prohibition may have removed that market stimulus. Whatever the factors operating in the late 1970s to depress America's heroin consumption. Clearly, the factors of prohibition and protection operated in the 1980s to revitalize the trade. Let's look at the heroin boom of the 1980s. Whatever cause of the decline in the 1970s, prohibition and protection again played a role, I would argue a key role, in the revival of U.S. heroin consumption in the 1980s. Let's turn now not to Southeast Asia, but to Southwest Asia, not to the Golden Triangle, as it's known in the argot of drug law enforcement, but they were really reaching for a catchy cliche here, to the Golden Crescent of Southwest Asia. In 1980-81, heroin production in Southwest Asia, Afghanistan and Pakistan, suddenly expanded to fill gaps in the global market. Although Pakistan and Afghanistan had zero heroin production in the mid-1970s, and that is absolutely clear, by 1981, Pakistan had become the world's largest heroin producer. Now let's look at the facts of the matter. Okay, I've gotten a hold of, through Freedom of Information, the reports in the mid-1970s by the former CIA director, Richard Helms, who was ambassador to Iran. And he kept a very close eye on the drug trade in Iran. And he documented very clearly that there was no regional heroin trade. There was a minor seizure picked up in Germany, and Ambassador Helms, using his skills, analyzed and reported at length, concluding that this region had no heroin consumption, heroin production, and no heroin consumption. So this is a region that's an opium producer. So in the mid-1970s, but is not a heroin consumer or producer. In 1981, however, the U.S. Attorney General announced that Pakistan was now the source of 60% of the U.S. heroin supply. Across Europe, Pakistani heroin captured an even larger share of local markets, the European market by this time being even larger than our own U.S. market for heroin. And moreover, the situation in Pakistan was even more dramatic. In 1979, Pakistan had 0 heroin addicts. In 1980, Pakistan had 5,000 heroin addicts. And in 1985, Pakistan, according to Pakistan official government statistics, had 1,200,000 heroin addicts. Now, why? Why did Pakistan emerge within the space of 2 years as the preeminent heroin producer, the center of the global heroin trade, from a position of non-participation? It all comes down to the Afghan operation, the largest, longest covered operation fought by our U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. After the Soviet Union began pressing into Afghanistan and ultimately invading in December of 1979, the White House under Carter assigned the CIA to mount a major operation to support the Afghan resistance to Soviet pressure and ultimately invasion and occupation. Working through Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, the CIA began supplying covered arms and finance to the Afghan forces that ultimately exceeded $2 billion. As they gained control over liberated zones inside Afghanistan, the Afghan guerrillas required that its supporters grow opium to support the resistance, paying a portion of their crop in tax to the Mujahideen resistance forces. Using CIA and ISI protection, the Pakistan military and Afghan resistance opened heroin labs on the border of the northwest frontier of Pakistan and Afghanistan. According to the Washington Post, page 1 of May 1991, among the leading heroin manufacturers during this period was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, then foreign minister in the Afghan interim government, and the Afghan leader who received something like half of the $2 billion in covered arms that the United States shipped to Pakistan. Hekmatyar was our guy. He was the one we picked. We elevated him from utter obscurity. We made him the most powerful of the Mujahideen. We gave him $1 billion in arms, and he was among the major heroin manufacturers that was responsible for this transformation of Pakistan. During this decade of operation, the Drug Enforcement Administration post in Pakistan made no arrests or seizures, participated in no significant arrests or seizures. Now, was it hard? You can say maybe it's hard. It wasn't hard. Let me give you an anecdote here. Well known, well documented. Mid-1980s, an Pakistani courier was picked up in Oslo, and he was caught with a shipment of heroin, part of this expansion of Pakistan into global markets. Norwegian police explained to him the prison term that he would likely to face. And armed with the information that this trafficker supplied, one Oslo detective, one cop from Norway, flew to Islamabad and began investigating. He mounted an investigation, and he ultimately brought down put behind bars a man who was the vice president of a major bank in Pakistan, who was the surrogate son of the dictator of Pakistan, General Zia, and who was the personal banker and intimate of General Zia. One Norwegian cop, not a country with a lot of clout in South Asia, brought down the surrogate son of the dictator of Pakistan. We had 17 DEA agents based in Islamabad during this entire period. We had clout in this region. We brought down nobody. We busted nobody. We seized nothing. Design, accident, I don't know. With the end of the Cold War, it seems that the United States-Soviet disengagement from Afghanistan, which started just last month, it's 28 days old, might lead to a worsening of the drug situation. Once the Soviet Foreign Minister and our own Secretary of State announced the termination of covered aid to their respective clients, Afghan guerrillas appeared to begin carpeting the slopes of Afghanistan with poppy seeds. UN estimates are that in the spring of 1992, the world will see an opium crop the like of which it hasn't seen since southwestern China in the late 19th century. And according to the U.S. State Department, the world's total illicit opium supply in 1991 was 4,000 tons. UN sources are estimating informally that this year Afghanistan is going to produce something close to 4,000 tons itself. Afghanistan is going to double the world's heroin supply this year. If correct, the Afghan crop would, of course, exceed Southeast Asia's, doubling the supply of heroin for the world market. Moreover, reacting to the depressed price of cocaine, the Colombian cartels have recently introduced opium cultivation into the northern reaches of the Andes. If the cartels do succeed in marketing heroin in the United States with the same success that they have cocaine, the prospects for an expansion in the U.S. narcotics traffic in combinations not even imagined or imaginable are quite distinct. Let me now reflect upon the policy implications of what I've said, this history lesson. Instead of the drug war with its doomed attempt at total eradication of drug use, there are several policy alternatives the United States could adopt to recognize, if you will, the complex character of heroin as a commodity. Let me propose, then, that somewhere between the poles of unrestrained repression, epitomized by our drug wars, and legalization, the alternative that we're often offered, we might attempt a new policy called regulation, carefully gauging each element in our enforcement strategy for its impact on this complex commodity trade. Instead of simply kicking down the doors in America or Bolivia, we might actually think about what we're doing and its probable impact. Among the elements in this putative policy of regulation would be some of the following, and I offer them very tentatively. First of all, the CIA. Elimination of protection. With the end of the Cold War, we should finally be able to end the agency's protection for traffickers, thus holding the periodic surges of narcotic supply from these protected and connected drug lords. Second, the DEA. By forcing the DEA to abandon its unreflective buy-and-bust approach, the U.S. government can restrain the DEA from making the matters worse. For 20 years now, the DEA has been kicking down the doors in Bolivia and Colombia and Turkey. A buy-and-bust approach, which has done, all it's done, I argue, is simply stimulate increased production of cocaine and heroin. I think it's time that we brought an end to this. After abandoning the DEA's bilateral enforcement effort, we can shift a portion of our international interdiction funds to the United Nations long-term multilateral cop substitution efforts. They may not work, but they probably don't make the matters worse. Realizing that enforcement serves as an informal customs barrier, we should, during this period, maintain our interdiction effort at the borders to avoid the flood of drugs that would allow supply to pursue demand on our streets. If we drop our enforcement effort entirely, enforcement comprising a kind of informal customs shields mean that we allow ourselves for something akin to dumping in the international drug trade. We would have supplies that chase demand. Finally, and ultimately, I think our solution must rely at the level of demand reduction. I, like many people that study the international drug trade, have come to this conclusion. It's a morass. It's hopeless. The variables, the factors out there are unknowable and unmanageable. We must realize that there is, thus, no supply-side solution to the drug problem. The entire drug war effort doesn't work, can't work, won't work. We must divert the 70% of the current drug war budget of $11 billion from repression to education and treatment. Ultimately, we must realize that there is no quick fix to the drug problem. Through this policy of regulation, we can stop the American state from using its considerable power to compound the problem. Then we can slow and stabilize domestic drug use, working over the long term for a gradual amelioration of this difficult problem. Thank you. Is that okay?
Questions?
Yeah, Al, could you comment on recent events in Burma, the last 2 or 3 years, and how some of the work against the various ethnic rebels?
Sure. The situation in Burma has gotten very complex. The dramatic event, which has been documented by Bertil Lintner in his books and in the pages of Far Eastern Economic Review, and it's wonderful reportage, absolutely superb stuff, and I commend it to your attention, has been the collapse of the Communist Party of Burma, which emerged in particularly Kokang State in northeastern Burma as the one of the leading, probably the most important opium collector and heroin manufacturer. And the collapse of the Communist Party of Burma through internal struggle, partly ethnic, partly generational, led to a breakup of a politically based resistance which was controlling a commodity and trying to apply it to the revolution, leading to the residual forces becoming just simply ethnic warlords like all the rest, allowing the Burmese state much more capacity to manipulate and control the situation in northeastern Burma. So that the Burmese state has become, in fact, a much more important protector of the traffic in northeastern Burma than it ever has been before. It always been a player, able to use its control over roads and certain key towns, access to chemicals and cash and financial services to favor the drug lords. But now the breakup of the CPB and the failure of any of the other ethnic rebels to really gain the kind of power that the CPB had has placed the Burmese state in a very important position. And the United States government has, for some reason, been unwilling to kind of grasp the fact that the Burmese state is, in fact, the major protector and probably the most important single principal factor in the heroin trade. And it's now been placed in a risible position where it goes in and, there are little rituals that are being conducted all over northeastern Burma where American drug enforcement agents and diplomats are going into the area and, looking at possible pilot aid programs in areas that are major heroin production zones. So it's a situation that's changed very dramatically. The other thing that's happened, too, is that as China's become more free market, the adjacent area of China has lost the strict military and market controls that's made it immune to trafficking. So the traffic in northeastern Burma is spilling across the border into China. One of the major trafficking routes out of northern Burma, which facilitates the shift of the heroin trade from the Thai border up into Kokang State, right fairly deep into the Shan states, has been the fact that the major trafficking route now out of the Shan states of northeastern Burma is across southern China into Hong Kong directly, right, by truck. So you don't have to go down through Bangkok anymore. That old axis of the Burma to Bangkok road is gone. And this parallels another very dramatic change as well, one I didn't canvass in my talk, which is very important. The whole Afghan operation did a number of other things that I couldn't discuss in the talk. As the Soviet Army suffered a kind of morale crisis akin to the American Army in Vietnam, this heroin that was being produced across the border for the world market in the northwest frontier of Pakistan also moved into Afghanistan itself. And there developed within the ranks of the Red Army in Afghanistan an undocumented but we believe to be a very substantial heroin abuse problem. And the Soviet-Afghan vets, who are rather like our own Vietnam vets, they feel very akin one to the other, kind of cannon fodder in a Cold War that's been forgotten by their own state, devoid of social services. They've gone back to Leningrad and Moscow. They're using heroin in phenomenal quantities. Moreover, the technology has moved across into the new, newly liberated Islamic states, which have the same ethnicity, the same geography, the same economics. They're now producing illicit heroin with the technology that they brought from Pakistan and Afghanistan. They're producing heroin for the Leningrad and Moscow markets. So the whole thing has really gotten really complicated. And the possibility of, Soviet Union, as it becomes short on cash, and the former Soviet states, Russia and these Islamic republics, becoming major principals in the drug trade is is quite real, producing unprecedented supplies and utterly removing any possibility of controlling or regulating the international production and flow of drugs, reinforcing what the thrust of my talk. Steve.
By focusing on the production and distribution side of heroin as a commodity, it only tells part of the story. I'm wondering if you're going to direct your analysis more towards the history of the social, cultural, and economic factors related to consumption, which may help to explain heroin as a commodity and the ebbs and flows of...
Why do people take drugs? Nobody knows. Okay, and that's something that's the one vast industry in the United States, the treatment industry, and it's very substantial. And they don't know. They really basically don't know. Historically, it's very little probed. We can document the history of the addiction. Dr. David Musto at Yale has done a wonderful job in his book, The American Disease, but not even he really fully explains why it happened. I tend to think, my theory, and I put it forward in the introduction to my book, and it's hypothetical. It's probably, I don't know, it's boldly presumptuous to even state it. Maybe it's even stupid, but just to demonstrate the rudimentary nature of why. One can document how, and one can quantify it, which is what the literature does, but to explain why. I think it's a part of a deep-seated social change that occurs, a fundamental change in the attitude towards diet and body and time that occurs in the West. As we urbanize in the 19th century, we move, I think, this is shoot from the hip analysis, as we move from small-scale operations in farm and factory, artisan-level work in which the rhythm and the regimentation of work was far less structured than it became in the factories in the 19th century. If you're worried, everybody has a certain rhythm to their lives. That we all know we're a night person or a day person or a morning person. When you became a factory worker in New England, the United States, or in the Midlands in England, you no longer controlled your daily rhythm. These machines were set at a very high pace, and during the 12 hours of the working day, these highly accelerated machines demanded peak performance, and they punished workers for non-achievement with a horrific level of industrial accidents. You didn't pay attention to the machine, they would take your hand or your arm away from you. So workers' diet changed, and if you think of what happened, I think, is that people are taking an exotic stimulants to artificially accelerate their body rhythms during this long working day. The classic English breakfast, which we can document in increased per capita consumption, is one of protein. The diet changes from mill grains in the 18th century to one of protein and exotic stimulants. Meat, eggs which are imported from China, frozen. Then a cup of tea with sugar. All right? Okay, these are sugar is glucose, energy, tea, caffeine, stimulus, protein for a sense of a sudden rush of productive energy, and then tea breaks in the factory. That's the one break you get, the tea breaks, for more caffeine to stimulate. So then you get workers, tea in England, coffee in America, artificially raising their body rhythms during the day. And then I think what's going on is we've learned to control our bodies. We learn to artificially stimulate and alter our moods with these drugs. We then use narcotics, coca and opiate, particularly opiate, to calm ourselves down. Right? Now, there's also a gender factor, too, which is complex as well. That alcohol abuse expands enormously in the 19th century, hence the temperance movement. And the prohibition of drugs is simply an extension of the temperance movement against alcohol. Now, there was a very strict division, gender-based division of substance abuse in the 19th century. Essentially, women were banned from public alcohol consumption. The pubs of England, America, Australia, the United States, the bars of America, these were male-only domains where socially sanctioned alcohol abuse was practiced and alcohol was abused in these settings. Women were not given access to that. It was considered improper. So what you get then, in a sense, is in the domestic sphere, in the vector of administering and nurturing, you get the abuse of pharmaceutical or patent medicine narcotics. And we have all kinds of literary evidence of this. Eugene O'Neill's play, Long Day's Journey into Night, Mary Tyrone is administered morphine by the doctor. And that's Eugene O'Neill's own mother. To Kill a Mockingbird, which is here. There's a woman opium addict, and that is the characteristic pattern. It's female, middle class, often narcotic abusers, and they get into it, I think, because the pharmaceutical companies are marketing these things in a nurturing metaphor, slotting them at children and children's diseases, and women get into them that way. That appears to be the vector. And so that makes another point, is that this commodity trade, when I said integral to first world lifestyles, I think it's far more fundamentally ingrained in our diet, our attitudes towards health and body, the way we reconceptualize what we do to our body. That's an unexplored terrain.
You mentioned cocaine several times in your talk. Do you think that your thesis of protection and prohibition would also extend to other drugs, including cocaine and LSD and various other things?
Brilliantly so. The cocaine, perfect. It applies. Absolutely. Protection, that's the whole Senator Kerry's hearing into the Contras. That's protection. We've only begun to probe the dynamics of protection between CIA, Oliver North's network, all that stuff, and the Contras and the that's a very complex and controversial area. But Senator Kerry documented clearly instances of protection. Guns down on licensed flights, bringing cocaine up to the United States. Okay, prohibition, 100%, 100%. Bolivia in the early 1980s. The cocaine production was concentrated in the western part of the country around the capital. The United States government went into Bolivia with aid to local police forces, mobilized a massive crop eradication effort that was quite successful, simply pushed coca into the fastness of eastern Brazil, ultimately into of eastern Bolivia, and then into the Amazon basin of western Brazil, where it's lodged now. Much larger area, much bigger crop. That dynamic has been demonstrated time and time again up and down the Andes. We've cracked down on the Colombian cartel with some success, it's said. Well, the processing is simply pushed back into the Apalaca Valley of Peru. Ecuador is now moving in. It's a dynamic trade. The market responds. Prohibition and protection, I think, are illuminating concepts to apply to the Latin American cocaine trade.
I'm interested. I used your book on a precursory manner. In other words, I just looked through it. And neither in your book nor in your discussion do you say anything about Indonesia. I wonder, what's your feeling for, the drug trade, drugs going into Indonesia or drugs coming out of Indonesia. And of course it interests me because, as we all know, or we all should know, we have one of the experts on Indonesian music right in the room today. And
what does that have to do with drugs?
Well, it has a lot to do with it because if in fact Indonesia, if the population of Indonesia has the kind of a culture that the people don't need drugs, then it seems to me that that's telling us something about Java as a culture.
Let me comment on that. Indonesia actually is distinctive in Southeast Asia for the high level of indigenous opium consumption during the colonial period. It's the one part of Southeast Asia where, in fact, the non-Chinese element of consumption was predominant and very important. The work done on the VOC trade between Bengal and Java established that one of the major commodities that animated the VOC trade in 17th century Java out of Batavia was opium. The East India Company imported Bengali opium into Java and distributed it, and placing it into sort of sending into the indigenous marketing systems. Moreover, by the late 17th century, in excess of 30% of all the cargoes leaving Batavia on intra-Asian commerce were opium for re-export to the archipelago and to China. In the 19th century, the Dutch opium regime, which has been wonderfully studied by Dr. James Rush now of Arizona State University, thank God at long last, we've gotten him back in the academy here, he established the scale and significance of this. And he's outlined in his book all kinds of very profitable avenues for inquiry. The opium regime was enormously powerful, and it supervised informally a very large legal and illicit traffic. Just the quantities that Rush describes. From Bali alone, in 1 year, one smuggling gang bringing in 40 tons of illicit opium to eastern Java. This was a trade that was phenomenally large. Robert Cribb I think where's Robert Cribb these days? Somewhere in Australia. Yeah, he's documented that the major source of finance for the Indonesian Revolution came from their expropriation of the Dutch colonial opium trade. So this is a topic whose import in Indonesia's political economy we only begin to understand. Moreover, I think if we moved into the study of sort of the actual life as it was lived on the fringes of the culture system in Java. The culture system was important because it generated the cash income which allowed peasants to buy opium. It turned out that there was a whole network that Rush documents of opium police, opium dens, brothels, music halls, a kind of netherworld in Java, a kind of free world where the opium police arbitrarily picked up people, arrested petty traffickers, didn't arrest, exercised a whole complex system of social control interfacing with the commodity. So the social life as lived in Indonesia is integrated with this illicit commodity in ways that we've only begun to understand. It's a very important topic.
But does the drugs, does Suharto, is Suharto right now involved in the international
No.
technology?
The Republic, after the revolution, extirpated the trade. It disappeared very quickly, and because Indonesia was an insular country, it had a natural boundary that could keep it apart from Southeast Asia, commerce in opium, which was confined largely to the mainland. So Indonesia drops out of the trade after 1950.
Last question.
Pakistan has recently said that it's not going to support the Mujahideen anymore, and they've also said that they're willing to sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Do you have any more information on linking the nuclear issue with the drug issue or something?
We're only beginning now, I think, and I'm not an expert on this at all, so this is an uninformed opinion. We're only beginning now to fully grasp the complex matrix of policy between U.S. and Pakistan in the 1980s. It involves some of the following components. All right, first of all, for our purpose, the question is, why do the United States adopt such a tolerant posture towards Pakistani heroin trafficking? Why do we let them basically have our market? Why do we not interfere? Why didn't we not bring down the traffickers the way the Norwegian police did? And those traffickers were operating at a very high level in Pakistani society. All right, the complex elements of the equation involve, first of all, one, the overarching issue during this period was the covert war. The covert war produced the bank, BCCI, a bank whose tendrils were only beginning to discover. This is a Pakistani bank. It was being used as the major conduit for CIA money into Pakistan to support the Mujahideen. We don't know yet. We know that the BCCI was moving cocaine money in the Caribbean. One thing that has not been probed, and there's no intention to probe because I don't think the Pakistan government is going to ever let it happen, is what BCCI was doing for Pakistan's bid for preeminence in the heroin trade. There's one thing that's very clear in the traffic in narcotics. You cannot send out your drug if you can't get your dollars back. You've got to have very elaborate financial services for what is a very complex commerce. Just imagine trying to move, say, $2 million in your car. Money management. Money management is a big industry. You cannot operate a major global commodity trade without a complex, elaborate system of financial support services. So you're going to tell me that there's no relationship between Pakistan's rise in the early 1980s as the world's major heroin exporter and BCCI's parallel rise as the biggest bank in the third world? I think there's some very interesting ties. All right, so that's one part of it. Another part of the puzzle, again, utterly unprobed, is the back door to Iran. We all know that during the 1980s, for complex reasons that we're only beginning to discover, the Reagan administration was shipping arms to Iran and was looking for a number of avenues to get the arms to Iran. Well, think of it. Right on the Iranian eastern border, we've got a $2 billion covered arms supply operation. And so far, Congress has only begun to probe that back door to Iran. I think, and Larry Lifschultz, writing in the Far Eastern Economic Review, the Times of India, has argued that one of the key pieces in the narcotics puzzle is the fact that the Pakistani government, Pakistani military intelligence, was in fact allowing the diversion of arms from the Mujahideen to Iran as a part of this whole Iran-Contra operation. And that then gave General Zia's regime extraordinary leverage, part of the leverage which was tolerated, all right? The drug trade, and then the nuclear factor in the equation. Why didn't the U.S. press Pakistan on the nuclear issue? Again, we have to put that lack of pressure on that issue and the drug issue against the other sides of the equation. The opening of strategic facilities for U.S. military operations in Pakistan, this intelligence angle, the backdoor to Iran angle, the supply for the Mujahideen. So it's a complex array, which so far in this society we've only begun to probe, and which is very interesting and very revealing. And then also the element of personal relations. William Casey's very close, intimate relationship with General Zia. The CIA director was very close to General Zia. He was the Reagan administration's top man for access. There was a very important channel there. And Mr. Casey's multifaceted capacity to manipulate the society is something that the U.S. Congress is going to hopefully be telling us about vis-a-vis the 1980 election. So we're not only looking at U.S.-Pakistan relations, not only looking at the drug trade, we're also looking very importantly, and this is a point I guess I want to end on. Okay? We share far more at the end of the Cold War with the peoples of Romania, East Germany, and the Soviet Union than we might realize. Just as they now are beginning to probe the pervasive influence of the Securitate, the Stasi, and the KGB in their societies, it's time for us to begin probing how our instrument, our counterpart, subterranean covert action agency, the CIA, influenced our society during the long years of the Cold War. We are, just in this society, victims of this national security establishment, and most visibly in the area of drugs. In the same way, in a more direct and even more unpleasant way, the peoples of Eastern Europe were victims of their own security agencies during the Cold War. And I think just as those people very courageously have begun to attack those agencies which are inimical to individual freedom in their societies, individual freedom and expression, I think it is time for us to begin investigating and pursuing the influence of our national security establishment. It's time for us to break it down and reclaim our civil liberties, reclaim full control over our government. Thank you.
Yes, David said that he couldn't make it.